Clint Eastwood stepped into town, minding his own business, when a smug sheriff leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You must be lost, old man." The town of Redstone fell silent. People watched, afraid to even breathe. But Clint, he just smiled, because he had a plan. What happened next turned the town upside down, destroyed a corrupt empire, and made history. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The town of Redstone was drowning in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind soaked in fear, the kind that settled deep in the bones of every man, woman, and child who dared to walk its streets. Sheriff Carter Hayes sat inside his office. The corner of his mouth curled into a smirk as he watched his deputies at work. Outside, two of them had cornered old Mr. Jenkins, the town's frail shopkeeper, just outside his own store. "You're a little late on your payments, Jenkins," one of the deputies sneered, tapping the old man's chest with a firm, unforgiving finger. I paid last week," Jenkins stammered, clutching the front of his shirt like it would protect him. The deputy chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah? Well, consider this next week's payment. Sheriff's orders." People hurried past, eyes glued to the ground. No one dared to intervene. Not in Redstone. Here, Hayes didn't just run the law. He owned it. Then something happened that hadn't happened in a long time. A black SUV rolled into town, its tires kicking up dust as it came to a slow, deliberate stop in front of the diner. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged here. Not in a place where men rode beat-up trucks and rusted-out sedans. The door swung open, smooth and steady. A man stepped out, tall, broad shoulders, a long coat dusted with the remnants of a long drive, a face carved by time, but hardened like granite, a pair of eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. Clint Eastwood adjusted his coat, taking in the town with a slow, knowing glance. Across the street, Johnny, a wide-eyed boy no older than 10, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Who's that?" he whispered. His father's face went pale. "Quiet, Johnny. Just keep walking." But Clint didn't just walk. He moved with the certainty of a man who had nothing to prove, yet everything under control. His boots met the dirt with a slow, measured rhythm as he crossed the street. Sheriff Hayes, still watching from his window, leaned forward. The smirk hadn't left his face. "Well, well," he muttered, rocking back in his chair. "What do we have here?" Inside the diner, the hush that had long lived over Redstone thickened, pressing in like the weight of a coming storm. Outside, Clint didn't stop. He didn't slow. He just kept walking, straight toward the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Hayes chuckled, tilting his hat back. "Looks like we got ourselves some entertainment." The wooden doors of the sheriff's office creaked open, but no one turned to look. Not at first. It wasn't unusual for people to walk in, some to beg, some to pay up, some to try their luck at pleading for justice in a town where justice was sold to the highest bidder. But when the boots that crossed the threshold belonged to Clint Eastwood, the air inside shifted. The room was thick with cigar smoke and easy corruption. A couple of deputies sat at a desk, counting a pile of crumpled bills, money that had no doubt been taken off the backs of struggling shopkeepers. A half-empty bottle of whiskey rested on the sheriff's desk, the glass beside it still wet. The wanted posters tacked on the wall were yellowed with dust, some curled at the edges, untouched for years. Sheriff Carter Hayes sat behind his desk, boots propped up, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched as Clint stepped inside. "Well now," Hayes drawled, tilting his hat back just enough to get a better look. "Didn't know we were expecting company." Clint didn't answer. His eyes moved slowly, taking in every inch of the room, the stench of sweat and whiskey, the glint of a revolver carelessly resting at one deputy's hip, the cocky arrogance dripping from every man inside. Hayes let out a short chuckle, taking his feet off the desk and leaning forward. "You lost, old man." The deputies snickered, their amusement filling the room like a bad joke. Clint exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, then took another step forward. "Nope," he said. His voice was low, steady. "Just looking at the trash that needs taking out." The laughter died. A single second stretched into an eternity. The deputy counting money froze, his fingers pausing mid-stack. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair, exchanging glances with his partner. No one spoke to Sheriff Hayes like that. Hayes, however, didn't seem rattled. If anything, his smirk grew wider. He leaned back again, folding his hands over his stomach. Big talk, he mused. Real big talk for a man who doesn't know how things work around here. Clint's gaze locked onto him, steady as stone. I know exactly how they work, he said, adjusting his coat. Hayes raised an eyebrow. And they're about to change. The room tensed as Clint's words settled. Hayes's smirk faltered for just a second, but that second was enough to send a ripple of unease through his men. The saloon doors swung shut behind Clint as he stepped out of the sheriff's office, his boots grinding against the dusty street. The town of Redstone was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that came when fear took root, when people knew better than to speak too loudly or look too long. From the windows of the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the tailor's, cautious eyes followed Clint as he walked down the street. A stranger in town was rare, but a stranger who spoke to Sheriff Hayes like that was something else entirely. A murmur started, whispers between townsfolk. Who is he? Did you hear what he said to Hayes? No one talks to the sheriff that way and walks away. Inside his office, Sheriff Hayes leaned against the window, watching Clint with a smirk that barely masked his irritation. He hated men like that, the kind who thought they could waltz into his town and challenge his rule. Hayes had spent years turning Redstone into his own personal kingdom, and one thing was certain: no one challenged him and lived to tell about it. Clint stepped into the town's only diner, the door creaking as he entered. The scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, but the usual lively chatter of the breakfast crowd had died down the moment he walked in. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a forced smile, watched him carefully as he slid onto a stool. Coffee, Clint said, voice calm as ever. She hesitated for just a second before pouring a steaming cup and sliding it toward him. He took a slow sip, savoring the bitter warmth, as the weight of the entire diner's gaze bore down on him. You should leave, the waitress murmured under her breath. Clint didn't react. He simply lifted the cup for another sip. That right? She cast a quick glance toward the window, where Hayes's office loomed across the street. Men who stand up to Hayes. She hesitated, lowering her voice. Don't last long. Clint set the cup down with a soft clink. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something steady, something unshaken. Neither do men like Hayes, he said simply. The air in the room seemed to thicken. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One man got up and left in a hurry, as if he didn't want to be around when the inevitable happened. Across the street, Hayes made his decision. His smirk widened as he turned to two of his men, lounging against the office wall. Go say hello, he said. The deputies nodded, adjusting their belts, hands resting just above their holsters. As Clint took another slow sip of coffee, the diner doors swung open. Two deputies stepped inside, eyes locked on him, hands twitching near their guns. The diner had gone dead silent. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Every set of eyes was locked on the two deputies standing in the doorway, their hands resting just above their holsters, their faces twisted with smug confidence. You got 5 seconds to get out of town, old man, one of them sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Clint didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply reached for his coffee, taking a slow, deliberate sip. His eyes, cold and unreadable, flicked toward the deputies. That's so? The taller of the two deputies stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. That's so, he confirmed. You don't belong here. Clint set his cup down gently. Funny, I was just starting to like the coffee. The shorter deputy scoffed. We're not playing games, old man. He reached for the baton strapped to his belt, ready to make a statement. His fingers barely grazed the handle before Clint moved. Fast, controlled, like a coiled snake striking its prey. Before the deputy could even register what was happening, Clint's hand clamped around his wrist like a vice. A sharp twist, a pained grunt. The baton clattered to the floor. The entire diner gasped. The taller deputy's eyes widened. Instinct took over. His hand shot toward his gun, but Clint was already looking at him. Calm, still, unshaken. You're not fast enough, kid, Clint said, his voice as steady as ever. For a split second, the deputy hesitated. His fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, but something about the way Clint looked at him made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear Clint showed, it was certainty. The kind of certainty a man only carried when he knew exactly how things would play out. The deputy's breathing turned shallow. His pulse pounded in his ears. He knew if he pulled that gun, he'd never even get the chance to use it. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled his hand away. The diner was so quiet now that the distant sound of horse hooves on the street outside echoed through the walls. The shorter deputy, cradling his injured wrist, shot Clint a glare filled with barely restrained rage. "You'll regret this," he spat. Clint simply picked up his coffee and took another sip, unbothered. The taller deputy let out a shaky breath, turned on his heel and stormed toward the door. His partner followed, but not before shooting Clint one last glare. As the doors swung shut behind them, the tension in the room lingered. No one had ever stood up to Hayes's men before. The waitress, still holding the coffee pot mid-pour, finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Outside, the deputies marched back toward the sheriff's office, shoulders stiff with anger. And inside, behind the large window of his office, Sheriff Carter Hayes watched it all unfold. His smirk had disappeared. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. A slow, calculating grin spread across his face. "That's how you want to play it, Eastwood," he murmured. He stood, reaching for his hat. "Let's see how long you last." The door to the sheriff's office slammed shut as Hayes paced across the room, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. His usual smug grin was gone, replaced by something colder, darker. No one had ever embarrassed him in his own town, and certainly not some washed-up cowboy who thought he could walk in and play the hero. He turned to his deputies, his voice sharp as a blade. "I want Eastwood out of here." Tonight, the men exchanged uneasy glances. After what happened at the diner, they knew Clint Eastwood wasn't just some stubborn outsider. He was dangerous in a way they didn't quite understand. One of them, Deputy Barnes, cleared his throat. "You sure about this, Sheriff? That man, he ain't normal. Didn't even blink when we tried to shake him." Hayes narrowed his eyes. "I don't pay you to be scared, Barnes. I pay you to handle problems. And right now, we got ourselves a big one." He grabbed his shotgun from the rack, slinging it over his shoulder. "Get your boys together. We pay Eastwood a visit after sundown." Meanwhile, across town, Clint leaned against the counter of a small general store, sipping on a fresh cup of coffee. The shop owner, an older man named Henry, wiped his hands on his apron, glancing nervously toward the window. "You shouldn't be out here, Mr. Eastwood," he muttered. Clint raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Henry swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "They're coming for you? Hayes don't let folks make a fool out of him. Never has." Clint took another slow sip, letting the warmth of the coffee settle. "A man who's got to send others to do his dirty work?" He shook his head. "Doesn't sound too tough to me." Henry's hands trembled as he restocked a shelf. "This ain't a joke. They'll come in the dead of night. Maybe 6 men, maybe 10. And Hayes? He ain't gonna stop until you're either run out of town or buried in the desert." Clint set his cup down and adjusted his coat. "Let him." Henry stared at him, mouth slightly open, as if he was looking at a man who didn't fully grasp the danger ahead. But Clint knew. He'd seen it before, and he wasn't losing sleep over it. He turned toward the door, tipping his hat. "Appreciate the warning, Henry." Then, without another word, he stepped out into the cooling evening air, disappearing into the growing dusk. Night fell over Redstone, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The town had a different kind of silence now, one that came with the weight of something inevitable. At the small roadside motel on the edge of town, Clint sat in a chair near the window, his hat tilted just enough to cover his eyes. His revolver rested on the wooden nightstand beside him, fully loaded. He wasn't a man who believed in luck. He believed in being ready. Then, just as expected, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, more than one pair. Clint didn't move. He just listened. The boots stopped just outside his door. A pause. Then the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. The doorknob started turning. Clint's fingers curled around his revolver. The real fight was about to begin. The night air outside the Redstone motel was thick with tension, the kind that made men walk faster and lock their doors twice. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. Inside, room 12 was pitch black, the curtains drawn, the only sound the slow, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Clint Eastwood sat motionless in a wooden chair by the window, his hat tilted slightly forward, hands resting on the armrests like a man waiting for a show to start. His revolver lay on the small bedside table, fully loaded. He didn't grip it, not yet. Then the first sound, footsteps, heavy, cautious, gravel shifting under boots. More than one pair. They stopped outside his door. A pause. Then the metallic click of a gun being cocked. Clint's eyes remained half-lidded. The doorknob twisted, slow, deliberate, locked. A brief murmur outside. A second later, bam! The door burst open, splintering at the hinges as four masked men stormed in, weapons raised. But the room was empty. The bed was untouched, the lamp unlit, just shadows swallowing the space. One of the intruders hesitated. "Where the hell?" Click. A dim light flickered on. Clint sat in the chair near the corner, one leg crossed over the other, his revolver resting lazily in his hand. His gaze was sharp, but his voice was calm. "Wrong room, boys." The hesitation lasted only a second before the first man lunged. Big mistake. Clint moved like lightning, grabbing the motel's cheap ceramic lamp and smashing it across the attacker's head. The man crumpled instantly. The second lunged with a knife, but Clint sidestepped, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and twisted hard. A sickening snap filled the room, followed by a howl of pain. The third man pulled his pistol, but Clint was faster. He kicked the chair toward him, the wooden legs slamming into his knees. The man yelped and staggered back. Before he could recover, Clint closed the distance and drove a fist into his gut. The man collapsed, wheezing. The last one stood frozen, gripping his shotgun tight, hands shaking. Clint turned to him, adjusting his hat. "Go on, pull the trigger." The masked man hesitated. Beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. "Thought so," Clint muttered. He stepped forward, grabbed the shotgun's barrel, and twisted it out of the attacker's hands before slamming the stock into his chest. The man hit the floor hard, gasping for air. The room fell silent, the only sound the groans of defeated men sprawled across the motel floor. Clint sighed, shaking his head. "That was just sad." One of the attackers, still dazed, coughed. "Sheriff's gonna kill you for this." Clint smirked, rolling his shoulders. "Let him try." Outside, distant sirens wailed, closing in fast. The real trouble was just beginning. The morning after the ambush at the motel, Redstone felt different. The usual tight-lipped silence was replaced by murmurs in alleyways and hushed conversations inside the saloon. For the first time in years, fear had shifted, no longer resting on the shoulders of the townsfolk, but on those who had built their power through it. It started with whispers. People at the general store murmured about how Clint had taken on 4 of Hayes's men and walked away without a scratch. The waitress at the diner shook her head in amazement, telling customers how Clint had simply sipped his coffee while 2 deputies threatened him in broad daylight. Stories spread like wildfire, each one growing more exaggerated. Some said Clint dodged bullets in his sleep, others that he snapped a man's wrist with just a look. The effect was immediate. Shopkeepers who for years had paid protection money to the sheriff's men hesitated when the next collection came. Mr. Abbott, the elderly grocer, stood firm when a deputy entered his store that afternoon. "Tell your boss I ain't paying a dime more," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in years. When the deputy sneered and reached for his holster, Mr. Abbott didn't flinch. Instead, 2 other townsfolk stepped forward. "If you got a problem with him," one of them said, "you got a problem with all of us." The deputy hesitated, then walked out empty-handed. Even within the sheriff's ranks, doubt crept in. Deputy Miller, who had been under Hayes's thumb for years, spent the morning staring at his reflection in the station's bathroom mirror. The bruises on his jaw, left by Clint in the town square, were a reminder that power wasn't permanent. Later that afternoon, Miller set his badge on Hayes's desk without a word. "You're making a mistake," Hayes growled. But Miller just shook his head. "Nah, sticking around is the mistake." He walked out, and for the first time in a decade, the sheriff's office had one less gun to call on. Sheriff Carter Hayes saw the cracks forming, and he didn't like it one bit. Sitting in his office, whiskey in hand, he listened to his men as they stumbled through excuses. "People ain't scared no more," one of them muttered. "Abbott refused to pay. Others too." Another added, "Miller quit, just up and left." Hayes's grip on his glass tightened. "That old fool Abbott should have been made an example of," he muttered. One of the deputies hesitated before speaking. "It's Eastwood, boss. Ever since he showed up, people started..." Crash! Hayes hurled his whiskey glass against the wall, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. His face turned red with fury. I don't want to hear that name again. Silence filled the room. The sheriff took a deep breath, then placed his palms flat on the desk, his tone low and dangerous. This town was mine before he got here. It's still mine now, and by sundown tomorrow, that old cowboy will either be in a grave or gone for good. Hayes narrows his eyes at his men. Get the word out. We're finishing this. Tonight. Sheriff Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers drumming against the wooden desk. His men stood around him, tense, waiting for orders. The town was slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers, and he knew it. The people weren't afraid anymore, and that made them dangerous. He needed to remind them who ran Redstone. His cold eyes settled on a name, a man who had lived in Redstone longer than anyone, a man who had always been respected by the people. Samuel Reed. The elderly shopkeeper had been in town for over 40 years, running the general store that had served every family in Redstone at some point. People trusted him, looked up to him, and that was exactly why Hayes needed to make an example out of him. The plan was set in motion within the hour. The door to Reed's shop burst open, and 4 of Hayes's deputies stormed inside. Shelves rattled as boots stomped against the wooden floor. Customers backed away, whispering in confusion. Samuel looked up from behind the counter, eyes narrowing. Something I can help you boys with? Deputy Grayson sneered. You're under arrest, old man. Samuel crossed his arms, unfazed. For what? Smuggling stolen goods, Grayson lied, grabbing Samuel by the arm. Gasps filled the store. Customers protested, but the deputies were quick to silence them with warning glares. The old man didn't resist, but his voice carried through the room as they dragged him toward the door. Everyone in this town knows I ain't never stolen a thing in my life, and so does your boss. Hayes stood outside watching with a smirk as the people of Redstone looked on in stunned silence. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to remember that he could still crush anyone who stood against him. But fear didn't spread the way it used to. Instead of looking away, people whispered. Instead of backing down, they stared Hayes down with quiet defiance. Later that afternoon, new posters appeared on every wall, fence, and storefront in Redstone. Wanted Clint Eastwood, criminal at large. A bounty of $5,000 was placed on his head. For a brief moment, people did panic. What did this mean? Would Clint leave? Would the town be swallowed back into the sheriff's rule? But then, just as the sun dipped low and the town square filled with uneasy murmurs, Clint walked right into the middle of it. The people turned, shocked. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He stood tall, his hands resting on his belt as his voice cut through the silence. I ain't the criminal here, he said, scanning the crowd, but I know who is. A young journalist standing near the saloon quickly raised his camera, recording every word. Redstone was about to learn the truth. The tension in Redstone thickened like a storm ready to break. Sheriff Hayes had spent years ruling with fear, but now the people were waking up. Clint stood tall in the center of town, the wanted posters with his name fluttering in the breeze ignored. The crowd around him grew, shopkeepers, farmers, townsfolk who had suffered under Hayes's corruption. You're stronger than this, man, Clint's voice carried through the square, steady as stone. You've just forgotten. Whispers spread. People exchanged glances, hesitant, unsure. Hayes had controlled them for so long. Could they really fight back? From the front of the bakery, an older woman clenched her fists. He took my husband's land, she muttered. A young blacksmith, still covered in soot, spat on the ground. He doubled my taxes last year. Told me if I didn't pay, I'd regret it. Clint nodded, watching the shift happening in real time. And what did you do? The blacksmith hesitated. Then, ashamed, he looked down. Nothing. Not your fault, Clint said. But it is your choice. What you do now. A ripple went through the crowd. The fire in them, long buried, began to rise. A teenage boy, barely 16, stepped forward. I remember when Redstone was a good town. My pa said it wasn't always like this. Clint knelt, meeting the kid's eyes. And it won't always be like this. But you gotta make sure of that. The boy clenched his jaw. Then slowly he turned toward the sheriff's office. One by one, the people followed. Boots thudded against the dirt road, cautious at first, then steady, then determined. A march of defiance moving toward the man who had stolen their town. Inside his office, Hayes sat at his desk, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. His deputies lingered by the windows, watching the crowd. Boss, one of them swallowed hard. They're coming. Hayes let out a cold chuckle, swirling his whiskey. Took 'em long enough. The muffled sounds of movement grew louder, voices rising, footsteps echoing. Through the streets, Hayes slowly stood, walked to the gun rack, and grabbed his shotgun. They think they can take my town? He pumped the shotgun with a sharp click-clack, his smirk darkening. Hayes turned to his men, voice low, dangerous. Time to remind him who really runs Redstone. The tension in Redstone crackled like a storm about to break. Sheriff Hayes stepped onto the wooden porch of his office, shotgun in hand, his boots thudding against the planks. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept over the angry crowd gathering before him. He had ruled this town through fear, but now fear wasn't working. Not with Clint Eastwood standing in the middle of the street, calm as ever, like a man who had already won. Last warning, Hayes growled, raising the shotgun, the metal glinting under the late afternoon sun. Turn around, get in that fancy car of yours, and leave while you still can. Clint tilted his head slightly, unfazed. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't flinch, just let the silence stretch. His piercing gaze locked onto Hayes like a wolf eyeing its prey. You really think they're on your side anymore? Clint's voice was quiet, but it carried through the square. Hayes frowned, then cast a quick glance at the people of Redstone. He expected them to shrink back like they always had, to avert their eyes, to stay silent. Instead, they stood firm. Eyes burned with something Hayes wasn't used to seeing, defiance. The blacksmith, still covered in soot, crossed his arms. The older woman from the bakery stood with her chin raised. The teenage boy clenched his fists, standing his ground. The entire town, his town, was staring back at him. Not with fear, with fury. For the first time in years, Hayes felt something crawl up his spine. Doubt. Y'all best remember who's in charge here, he barked, voice cracking slightly. I built this town, kept it running. No, Clint corrected, stepping forward. You kept it afraid. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hayes' grip on the shotgun tightened, sweat beating at his temple. He wasn't used to this, being questioned, being challenged. He had controlled Redstone for so long that he had started believing he was untouchable. But now he was standing on the porch, shotgun raised, and not a single soul stood beside him, except his deputies. He turned slightly, just enough to see them shifting on their feet. He expected loyalty, but what he saw was hesitation, uncertainty. One of them, Deputy Cole, wasn't even looking at him anymore. He was looking at Clint. And then Cole took a deep breath, stepped forward, and pulled out his handcuffs. What the hell are you doing? Hayes snapped, eyes widening. Cole hesitated for only a second, then squared his shoulders. Doing what we should have done a long time ago. Before Hayes could react, Cole grabbed his wrist, snapping the cuffs around it. The town gasped. Hayes wasn't the law anymore. He was the prisoner. The air in Redstone felt different, lighter, freer. It was as if the town had finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. Sheriff Carter Hayes, once the self-proclaimed king of this dusty little kingdom, now stood in the middle of the street with his hands bound behind his back, his face pale and rigid. The weight of his downfall was settling in, and for the first time, he had no control over the situation. Deputy Cole stood beside him, jaw tight as he secured the cuffs. Carter Hayes, you're under arrest for corruption, extortion, and abuse of power. His voice rang through the square, firm and unshakable. The townsfolk stood frozen for a moment, as if their minds couldn't quite process what they had just witnessed. Then, like a spark to dry kindling, a roar of cheers erupted. People clapped, whistled, and embraced each other. Shopkeepers who had been forced to pay protection fees wiped their eyes, relieved that they no longer had to fear the sheriff's men barging through their doors. Mothers held their children close, knowing the streets were finally safe for them. The blacksmith shook hands with the baker. The saloon owner slapped the bartender's back, all of them realizing that, at long last, Redstone belonged to them again. Hayes clenched his teeth, trying to maintain whatever dignity he had left. You all think you're free? He spat, voice laced with venom. You needed me. I kept order in this town. Clint Eastwood, standing a few feet away, finally stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. He tilted his head slightly, studying Hayes like a man looking at a snake that had finally lost its fangs. Order, Clint scoffed. That's what you call robbing folks blind and running this town on fear? Hayes' eyes darted around, searching for an ally. anyone who might step forward and defend him. But there was no one. Even the few remaining deputies kept their eyes on the ground. "You brought this on yourself, Hayes," Cole said, gripping his arm and leading him toward the sheriff's office, soon to be his own jail cell. "And now, it's over." The townspeople erupted again, their voices strong, their relief evident. It was a moment they never thought would come. As the celebration continued, a young boy weaved his way through the crowd, his eyes wide with admiration. He tugged at Clint's coat sleeve, his small voice cutting through the noise. "Mister, what now?" Clint glanced down at the boy, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, with the ghost of a smile, he adjusted his coat, glanced toward the diner, and drawled, "I think I'll grab some coffee." The boy grinned, watching as Clint strolled toward the diner. The weight of justice settled, but the legend still walking. The sun hung low over Redstone, casting a golden hue across the streets that had once been ruled by fear. Now, laughter and conversation filled the air, voices no longer hushed with caution. People moved with a newfound lightness, as if the invisible chains that had bound them for years had finally been shattered. Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the town square, watching it all unfold. He had seen towns like this before, ruled by men who mistook fear for loyalty, who believed power was something they could own. But men like that always made one fatal mistake. They forgot that real power only existed as long as the people allowed it. Sheriff Carter Hayes was gone, locked away in his own jail, awaiting the justice he had long denied others. His men had either fled or surrendered, and the town had wasted no time in reclaiming what was theirs. A group of townsfolk gathered around Clint, gratitude written on their faces. The shopkeeper, who had been arrested on false charges, stepped forward, shaking Clint's hand with a firm grip. "Don't know how to thank you, mister," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Didn't think we'd ever be free of him." Clint gave a slow nod. "A man's only powerful if people let him be," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. Deputy Cole approached, standing beside Clint as he surveyed the town. "They'll be talking about this for a long time," he murmured. "About you," Clint exhaled, tilting his hat slightly. "Let 'em talk," he said, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. It wouldn't take long before word of what had happened in Redstone spread beyond its borders. Stories had a way of traveling faster than the wind, and this was a story people wouldn't forget. Clint Eastwood, the man who had walked into a town ruled by corruption and left it standing tall. A journalist who had been documenting the events rushed forward, notebook in hand. "Mr. Eastwood," she called, "what do you have to say about what you did here today?" Clint glanced at her, then at the town around him. He adjusted his jacket, taking his time before answering. "Didn't do anything they couldn't have done themselves," he finally said. "They just needed to be reminded they could." The reporter scribbled down his words, but before she could ask another question, Clint had already started walking away. As he moved toward his car, the same young boy from before ran up to him, eyes wide with admiration. "Mister, are you gonna stay?" he asked hopefully. Clint crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "Nah, kid," he said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Town's in good hands now." The boy nodded, understanding more than his young years should have allowed. Clint gave him a parting wink, then climbed into his car. With one last glance at the town of Redstone, he started the engine and pulled away, leaving behind a legend that would only grow with time. As the dust settled, the story of Clint Eastwood's stand against corruption spread like wildfire, an outlaw of justice in a modern world. Redstone was free, but the legend? It was just beginning.